Okay, so we're back. Hello, Ray.
Hello, Rich.
So, firstly, I'm just going to ask you, what have you noticed in the time since we've spoken last?
I've noticed a lot of sport on TV, some of which the two of us watched together. There was a football tournament, and though I'm not a huge football fan, I ended up watching some football with you. And I kind of noticed sort of how many times I've been round that, how many different tournaments for different sports over all the years, often ending up in mild disappointment. What about you? What have you noticed?
It feels like loads has happened. We recorded the first episode on, well, it was Independence Day in the States, and some might say Independence Day in the UK as well. We had
Mhm.
an election, we had a general election, and a big change in the UK. Yeah, the Conservative government suffered a pretty huge blow, and yeah, now we have a Labour government. I suppose I'm reflecting on that. I'm also finding myself quite obsessed with the US presidential election and everything that's going on there, and assassination attempts and all sorts. So that's what I noticed myself thinking about quite a lot.
It's not been a quiet time, has it, the last few weeks?
There's a lot going on in the world. And so today then, so we said we were going to talk about, well, we're going to slightly further unpack the title of our podcast, which is Two Old Psychologists Talking About Stuff. And we wanted to move on from two and connection to old and aging, and just sort of throw around this whole concept of aging. Now, I feel like I'm going to defer to your expertise a little bit because you're older than me. No,
'Cause
that's not that's
'cause
not
I'm old. Yeah.
that's not the reason, although you are older than me. Just want to get that out there.
For avoidance of doubt, yes.
For avoidance of doubt, Ray Owen is older than me by several years, I'll have to say. You know, not 10, more than 5. The reason I wanted to defer to your expertise was because you have your career has largely been working in and around fields of physical health and end of life care.
Mm.
So you know, the topic of aging, the topics around mortality must be, you know, that's kind of your bread and butter, right?
It's definitely been a theme in there. There's this slightly weird paradox that, particularly conditions like cancer, which I've been particularly involved in working with, on average is a disease of older people. So the overall profile of people with cancer tends towards the older. And anybody involved in psychological care and support actually tends to end up seeing the younger end of that profile. So, for a variety of reasons, some of them absolutely on the money and fair, some of them a bit unfair about societal prejudices. So yes, a lot of the time we are thinking about age, passage of time, but also interestingly, I did end up seeing a lot of differentially of younger people within that.
Aging seems to be something that there is somewhat of a stigma around in our culture. I'm not saying that's the same for every culture. I think, you know, there is certainly you could point to some cultures where age is associated with wisdom and, you know, the whole idea of the elders and respect doesn't kind of feel quite like that within our culture. And certainly it feels like people who are at the you know, the end towards the end of their life, people post-retirement, let's say, don't seem to get quite as much respect as maybe they might do elsewhere. Do you think that's a fair thing to say?
I think it I think it absolutely is, as one of those people increasingly. That's kind of how it feels. I mean, I don't know about you, Rich. I'm always slightly cautious about, what is different and better in this culture or this culture. I mean, that may well absolutely be true. I would want to talk to a sample of 20 older people from that culture about what their actual experience is rather than what the sort of the headline is. But I think it is true. We see quotations from like Roman philosophers and people, saying back 2,000 years ago, saying, "Oh, the trouble is young people these days don't respect their elders." So it might be that it's always felt like this, or it might be that in these kind of like capitalism dominated times, worth is tied to earning ability. And as people get older, they become sort of economically less relevant. So maybe that's a part of it as well.
It's really interesting that you say that because it feels like a standard line of mine these days whenever I get onto a bit of a rant about anything. The at the basis of it is the sort of relentless pursuit of economic gain. It sort of feels
Mm.
like it's at the root of all evil. So yeah, I wonder if there's quite a lot in that, isn't there? That older people are sort of seen as being somehow less able to contribute to the relentless pursuit of economic gain, and therefore are afforded a lesser position within society.
They're less important because the thing that is important is your ability to be productive. And again, I'm sure if we looked carefully at it, lots of those assumptions don't really hold up about what people are producing, what people are contributing to society, and the worth of that, the relative worth of somebody who, if we're going to be all cliched about it, has the time to make marmalade and, distribute it amongst their friends versus the person who is putting in the 12-hour working day on venture capitalism, which is just destroying lives. What we take of the two of those, which of those is more productive, depends on your value base.
So you're in B&Q and you are looking for some help in the selection of a power tool, and the person serving you in situation one looks about 25. Situation two, they look about 65. Would you prefer to be in situation one or situation two?
I think in that specific context, I think situation two, as a person who knows the limits of my own competency in matters of DIY, and they are pretty low limits, I think I would definitely defer to the concept of experience more than the concept of youth in that setting. It might be a different story if I was at the gym who was offering me advice, but certainly in B&Q, yep, I'm going option two.
I feel like I need to say other hardware stores are available.
And certain hardware stores, your chance of actually finding somebody to help you and advise you is also close to zero on recent experience, but that's another time.
I feel like we're going to come back, or if we haven't already, to this whole "it depends" and "context matters" issue that we touched upon last time. In that, I guess what you want out of people has a bearing on whether issues like age come into play or not in your thinking.
Absolutely, both in the sense of, I think, what's the benefit of years of experience and is that relevant to this context? Versus the other thing we've got to set against it is how up to date are people? If I'm asking somebody for help with a computer problem that I have, I'm probably going to be looking at the much younger person who looks like he's never been more than 2 meters away from a computer in his short life, versus somebody of my age who's kind of scratching his head and bemoaning the old days of floppy disks.
Floppy disks, fantastic.
Back
That's
when
a
floppy disks were actually floppy as well, in cardboard
in
covers rather than
cardboard.
these
Yeah,
rigid plastic innovations, which I don't approve of.
we are two old psychologists talking about stuff, and I think we've really honoured that title with the with the reference to floppy disks. This idea of context being important. One can't be obsessed with the American presidential election and miss the fact that Joe Biden's age has become a massive issue. I mean, I think it was there, and subsequent to a televised debate
Mm.
with Trump, where Joe Biden seemed to struggle. He seemed like he was cognitively not quite there at some points. It's become an enormous talking point. So, notwithstanding the fact that somebody's performance in a television debate, it probably becomes more important than their entire political kind of legacy, which maybe is a marker of our times. It does feel like the context is hugely important here. That we are talking about, a head of state, arguably the most important head of state in the world, and everybody seems to be looking at his age as being a factor. The guy's 81. We're talking about term of office where he's going to, if he wins, he's going to be into his mid 80s, and people are really questioning his ability to do the job given his age. And it's got me sort of wondering about how much that is to do with his age, full stop, as in the number 81,
Mm.
or whether it's to do with the perception. of his age and kind of how he looks. Because Donald Trump, I think I'm right in saying he's 78, so he's no
Yeah.
spring chicken either. Yet he just looks like a much more energetic figure, particularly now he's survived an assassination attempt with his fist pumping.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the number could be an issue, and I guess if we make predictions about what tends to happen as we get into our 80s and into our 90s, sort of I think there's a widespread perception that aging can accelerate somewhat, and a 10-year difference between 40 and 50 is a bit different from a 10-year difference between 80 and 90. So yeah, absolutely, those questions for both candidates might well be there. I think the issue, as I observed it, was that the shortcomings that were apparently on show there, fitted a picture of a mental slowing, of not being able to grasp the situation quite as quickly and come up with a solution. And I don't know, what do I want for my self-styled leader of the free world? There's another whole phrase to unpack. But yeah, I quite like them to be able to grasp a situation fairly quickly. And no matter how good the people around them are, to be able to do that even if they've had a bit of a tiring day. And so that seems, rather than just sort of, showmanship, what looks good on the telly, that actually seems like a pretty important requirement of the job.
Yeah, and I can see why people look at him and think he just doesn't quite seem to have the mental acuity or flexibility to respond to the kind of pressures that are likely to be coming across his desk in a relentless way, for the next 4 or 5 years or so.
Yeah. And I guess particularly in an explicitly presidential system, it's a president, where the populace is voting for a named individual, unlike in the British system, although effectively people often are within the British system. Explicitly, that's not the case. You're voting for a local MP, and the largest group of MPs will produce a prime minister. Well, in America, you're voting for that person, and they may have assemble an extremely able team around them. And yet, there is going to be a moment where the person at behind the desk in the Oval Office has to decide how to respond to some crisis. And so I can understand people having caution. I don't think it's just ageism for the sake of ageism. This is about fitness to task, not mental fitness capacity. We're not making judgments about that, but fitness to task.
For me, I think there's an interesting juxtaposition of two things here. I mean, I think if you're thinking about electing leaders, but I'm just using that as a kind of touchstone, there's the idea of the elder statesman, stateswoman, statesperson. We kind of want wisdom and experience in our leaders, well, not too, not at the expense of the kind of things that one loses as one ages. So it feels like there is a discussion here about what do we gain during the process of aging, and what do we lose, and what's the sort of relative weight of those two things. I wanted just to move the conversation away from America for a moment. On a personal level, what do you feel like you've gained and lost as you've got older?
I actually noticed this very explicitly a couple of years ago. I was watching the popular TV game show Countdown, where you're encouraged to sort of solve anagrams or do combination of letters to make words and solve mental arithmetic tasks.
Life in the fast lane, eh?
That is me exactly.
Live fast, die young, leave a good-looking corpse. Yeah.
Yeah, it could. You can actually see the T-shirt I'm wearing. And what I noticed, having kind of intermittently watched it over many years, is my vocabulary continues to probably get bigger over time, and the ability to sort of come up with anagrams continues to probably get somewhat better. But my ability to do mental maths has declined. And that kind of intrigued me when I noticed that, because it really felt like, yeah, okay, so there's an accumulation of knowledge thing with knowing more words and having seen more occasions of different combinations of letters. That felt like like a parallel to accumulation of wisdom. It's not deep wisdom, but it's kind of wisdom. But with the mental maths thing, what I also know is just my working memory, my ability under pressure to hold this sum in my mind while I do this sum and then bring the two of them together. And that's the bit I can just feel getting weaker. So in that balance of what we gain in terms of accumulating learning, elaborating a learning history, It's like is one line on a graph that's kind of going upwards over time. And then there's this other line that after, I suppose, adulthood, early middle age begins to tail off, which is just some of those core acuity processes of how quick we are. Again, very depressingly repeating myself, that's going to be different in different settings where that is. I certainly notice it. I mean, what about you? You young whippersnapper, you know, almost 10 years younger than me. What do you notice?
I think it's interesting because I've definitely noticed changes. So, I mean, we're talking cognitively for the moment, aren't we? I guess we could come on to kind of bigger issues later, but cognitively, the biggest thing I notice is my memory. That everything used to just be at my fingertips, remembering perhaps names, dates, concepts, words, actually, word finding. I'm finding that increasingly elusive. The ability to just effortlessly speak in an incredibly fluent way. A bit worrying, seeing as I'm approaching this new venture of doing a podcast. But I find I'm not quite as fluent as I used to be, and I struggle to remember certain things in a way that I definitely would not have struggled before. That's the one thing. And the other thing I notice, and I don't know whether this is connected with aging or whether I've just developing a slow growing tumor in my cerebellum, is just I can't type without making mistakes. Whether that's on a phone or on a keyboard, if I was just sort of free typing, I would say probably 30 to 40% of the words would have a mistake in them. And I don't think I used to do that. I don't know what's going on there. I think one of the problems is you can compare yourself to other people, but they're other people. In terms of you yourself as a unique, 1 in 7 billion human experiment, you sort of don't know, do you, whether these things that seem to be happening are part of the aging process or something else.
And if they are tied to the aging process, whether they are directly a consequence of that aging process or a secondary effect of something else, of having like an increasing number of other hassles to deal with, which distracts you away from this thing. It is difficult at times being able to tie down what's what, and also notice the things that I don't know about you, that some stuff I've always been crap at. I know I've always had a very particular problem with faces, to the extent there's a neuropsychological condition. I'm not a neuropsychologist myself, but I'm very well aware of. There's a neuropsychological condition called prosopagnosia, where people really struggle to tell the difference between faces. You can show them a set of faces and people they know really well, complete strangers, and they can't say which they've met before. Okay, that's at its rarest, most extreme. But I can have met people 2 or 3 times and genuinely not recognize their face at all and not be able to tell whether I've met them before. So I know there's some things I've always been bad at, but it is troubling when more things come in. And, of course, you referred earlier to my background in working in end-of-life care and with conditions that quite reasonably lots of people fear, like cancer, like motor neuron disease and things. But of course, it does raise the other thing that perhaps I think one of the biggest fears societally now is dementia. What are hopefully normal age-relating, reductions in mental acuity. There's also sitting behind that the thought that, oh God, is this the first sign of, something that many of us kind of fear more than those purely physical conditions.
I must admit that is terrifying, isn't it? I find that concerning, not because of a loss of mental acuity. The thing that terrifies me more than anything there is the sort of loss of self, like a loss of personality, not being me anymore. I was talking to a colleague just yesterday who was talking about their a grandparent and was saying that this grandparent sort of doesn't really know who the family are anymore. But the sort of in some ways the worst bit is they don't know who the grandparent is anymore because
Right.
they're kind of not like they were. They've started behaving in ways that they would have never behaved previously, and so that's some cruelty of that kind of destruction of the person themselves that feels, to me anyway, way more frightening than the idea of being worse or slower at maths, for example.
Yeah, and of course there are some forms of dementia where it almost selectively kind of targets that personality bit and changes in the extent to which a person is able to empathize with other people or be caring. So, you meet people who've been tremendously caring and kind people all their lives who've become, really, really difficult to be around and really verbally abusive of the people that they have always loved. And you know, one of the greatest tragedies of that, again, I kind of heard this many times, is the idea that if that person 5 years ago time traveled forward and watched what they were doing now and how they're treating the people around her, they would just be devastated. It's so far from the person they'd always been.
That's frightening, isn't it? It feels more frightening in a way because I would say one of the things I've gained from getting older is just being a bit more relaxed and more comfortable on my own skin. I don't think you would have known it had you known me. You'd have probably experienced me as, I don't know, maybe quite a fun, happy go lucky person. But I think, like in my younger days, and I think a lot of that was a kind of avoidant strategy. You know, it was a sort of deliberate strategy to be liked, born out of a certain, anxiety and sense of inadequacy. Whereas now I just don't feel that. I think that's a nice thing about getting older is just not having the pressure. I sort of do what I want really without worrying too much about what other people think about me. That sounds selfish saying it out loud, but it doesn't feel like I'm being really selfish. It feels like I'm just less concerned with having to impress other people.
So the question that prompts in me, Rich, is, so are you a grown up yet?
Well, isn't that strange? I mean, there's such a strange thing. Like, I look in the mirror and I see a completely different guy looking back at me from, I don't know, what do we say, 30 years ago. And yet somehow there's this part of me that just sort of feels the same. I find this fascinating because on a biological level, I'm almost entirely made of different stuff.
Mm,
All of us,
yeah.
I forget the frequency of this, but our cells sort of die and regenerate.
Yeah, lots of
Um,
them do. Yeah, yeah.
so so like most of the cells I had when I was born are now are long since dead, comprised of completely different material, yet I'm still me. Like, I mean,
Mm.
that this is just mind-blowing. So mind-blowing that I've actually forgotten the question that you asked me.
Are you a grown up yet?
I suppose so. Objectively, obviously, I have lots of responsibilities in life that I wouldn't have had as a child, for example, and I think I can respond to things in a very mature and grown up manner. And there's still a part of me that feels just like I'm young and foolish and don't know what's going on. Haven't really got life sorted. So it's a weird kind of paradox that I don't think I'm alone in that. I think lots of people that I speak to feel like they're sort of hanging on to life by the skin of their teeth at the same time as being very competent.
And I think we spend a lot of our time surrounded by people who definitely seem like grown ups. Kind of for me, part of this is that old thing of, we compare our insides to other people's outsides. So we see these people being kind of competent and handling, objectively very difficult situations with maturity and whatever. And, probably other people see us as doing that some of the time. But the difference is we know what we feel like inside while we're doing it. And oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing. I wish somebody competent was here in order to be making this decision, which of course is what's going on for those other people as well. But we just don't get to see that. But gosh, we get to see it in ourselves. So we're surrounded by all these grown-ups and we are just God, one day maybe I'll be on top of this. One day maybe I'll know what to do in this circumstance. But in reality, all you do is you just get, I guess, more able to cope with not knowing.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think sort of in my university job where I'm training novice therapists who are obviously much younger than me for the most part, I think that's the thing I try and communicate to them. That they often report a sense of like an imposter syndrome or
Mm.
feeling like they're a fraud. And they look at me and they say, "Oh, I just want to be like you and as confident as you." And I'm like, "Wow, it's funny you should say that." Because I still have that I'm a fraud thing. And I think a lot of people of my peer group have that as well. I think what changes is that you just become better at accepting that that's just part of the deal. You become better at accepting and living alongside this sort of side of you that's full of self-doubt.
And maybe sometimes to some extent valuing it as well. I suppose one of the questions I most often ask is what would the opposite of that look like? And the opposite of that would look like being utterly sure that you're in the right all the time and that whatever you think is the right thing to do. Well, I met people who I strongly suspect that is their inner life, but I haven't necessarily liked them very much. And I
No,
don't
and
think I
and and
particularly want to be one of them.
no, and who'd want a therapist like that?
Yeah.
Who's completely sort of narcissistic and, I know what's right for you. That's not an attractive quality in a therapist or indeed a friend. Okay. So I feel like there's lots of things we could talk about in relation to this. I mean, I'm really interested in talking to you about mortality, given your experience in end of life care, but I
Mm.
kind of feel like that might be such a big topic, it probably deserves its own episode. You ready for your question?
Oh, my question, yeah.
Let's go and ask Ray, shall we?
Okay, so technology is advanced to the point where we could lop off your head and put it in a jar and freeze it until such time as you can have a kind of completely animatronic body. And so we sort of press pause on your life and you come back, or whatever it is, 3,000 years into the future, and you can sort of achieve immortality. Are you interested?
I'm not interested in the immortality bit of the deal. I'm very interested in the chance to see what 2 or 3,000 years would look like, but I would definitely want opt-out clause at the end of a bit of time of seeing it. Yeah, immortality does not feel like a good deal to me.
Well, this is boring because I feel exactly the same as you.
Oh,
About
damn.
that. I was hoping we'd disagree and have a heated debate. No, I'm exactly the same. Immortality sounds awful, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, how do you cope?
Yeah. What would you do? I mean, but I am just being a bit. I mean, we share this. I think being sort of sci-fi geeks, we're
Oh gosh,
interested
yeah.
in sci-fi books and films and TV shows, and so there is that bit of me that really desperately wants to see into the future to see what happens. So
Yeah,
I'd like a little glimpse, but yeah, not sure I'd want to live there.
a real glimpse of the smouldering rock that this planet will be for the rest of eternity. And in order to be able to say, "Yep, view it." Right,
Yeah.
where's the off switch?
The idea of being sort of woken from a slumber of several thousand years and being put back into another body just conjures up sort of Frankenstein's monster to me, and I think I'd probably find it so discombobulating that I would be the like him, throwing a girl into a lake within a few minutes and being chased down by a bunch of torch wielding villagers.
Yeah, well, it's good to have a career plan, isn't it?
Okay, so neither of us are up for immortality, but maybe a glimpse into the future.
That would be fun.
Okay, maybe we can contact Elon Musk, or maybe he'll sort that out for us. Right, it's been a pleasure. See you next time.
Indeed. Speak to you then.